This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Newton.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. The three of us, before we started recording, we're discussing our evening last night, and we all, in some form or fashion, tuned in to the debate between the presidential candidates.
Yep.
I think we're all disillusioned. Well, nothing changed, perhaps.
No, nothing changed.
Right. So.
It was pretty much what I expected it to be, which is usually disillusion.
Yeah. And while we're not going to break down the debate by any
No.
means, that'd be a waste of everyone's time and our interest. But it reminded us that we have an episode about Kamala,
Yeah.
dating back to, when was it?
So it's episode 2.10 from March 11th of 2019.
Wait, episode 2.10?
Yep, 2.10 is the number on it.
I know we were talking before. We
It was
thought
our second episode, though.
second season.
Second
Oh,
season.
it was.
I know.
Season 2, episode
We were
10.
discussing.
Got you.
We remember a memory of being in our old quote studio on the other side of campus. I remember that too, but I don't think we were.
Okay.
Anyway, and so it's just funny that we had a whole episode. Of course, it wasn't about her. It was about an initiative to legalize prostitution.
But she was behind it. That was the whole
Correct.
point. Yeah.
And so we didn't discuss her as much as
Yeah.
we discussed the idea of sexuality and
Right.
sex and so forth. But it's just ironic that we have this episode about with her name in it. I think her name's in it or something.
It
like,
is,
no,
yeah.
it's Indecent Proposal. I believe,
Indecent
isn't it?
Proposal is the title, but the
Yeah.
description has her
Yeah.
specifically. And what I remember about it is we were trying to make sure we pronounced her name right.
Yes.
Because we didn't know if it was Kamala or Kamala, and we were going back and forth. And we finally had to find some video that helped us to make sure that we said her name properly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just funny to see her debating last night. It's like, oh, yeah, we actually talked about her once. So, yeah, do you want to, if you've not heard that episode, go back and check it out. It's available, as is all of our previous
As are
episodes.
all the episodes we've done in the last
Yeah.
25 years.
Yeah.
You're welcome to check them out.
Exactly.
Well, today we are heading to our last chapter of the book of James. And we may or may not finish. There's a chance we'll finish our
Right.
study through James today. If not, we're definitely in the home stretch. But we're in section 3 of the book, of the structure of the book, right? We talked about the book having an introduction with kind of a thesis and maybe a little preview of things to come and a theme verse that may serve as a table of contents. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And last time we began the slow to anger section, which kind of partially begins with the 2 kinds of wisdom in chapter 3, but really the heart of it is chapter 4, this friendship with the world. These worldly ambitions, these worldly ideologies and worldly wisdom that's being brought into the church. It's just bringing conflict and division and anger and all sorts of negative fallout. And James is pushing against all that. And arguably this kind of pushback against the world crescendos at the beginning of chapter 5 with almost a prophetic indictment. And so today we're going to wrap up the slow to anger section and then get to the conclusion of the book.
Yeah. So I'm going to begin in chapter 5, verse 1. Although I noticed before I got into it that 13 has this phrase, "Come now, you who say," and then chapter 5 begins, "Come now, you rich people."
Right,
And so there's
yeah.
some parallelism in that. So these sections probably should be seen together. It's the one we ended with last time in this new section.
Agree.
So verse 1 says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you." Is that how far I'm going?
I think so. That
Okay.
was be the
That's
break
in that
for
section.
for that section.
Yeah, it's, we mentioned it, I think, last episode, but this completely reminds me of the 8th century prophets.
Yeah.
Who they're just laying into the injustices that are out there. And he's very specific here about what they're doing. And it's the same sorts of things they did back then, that they're taking advantage of their fellow countrymen. Back then, it was like we might call it debt slavery, where they surround on money, and so they sell their property to the person, and they sell themselves to the person, and they're being taken advantage of. And Torah had things to stop that. but they didn't keep Torah. And here they seem not to be just being kind and gracious to one another, but instead taking advantage of each other. And it's a classic rich get richer, poor get poorer situation.
Yeah, it's selfishness versus generosity, without a doubt. And I can't help but notice the parallelism where he says, "Come out, you rich, weep and wail for the miseries to coming upon you," which echoes a little bit of what we saw back in verse 9 of the previous chapter. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, your joy to dejection. And so it's that same kind of mentality. I think reinforcing that you need to be overwhelmed by grief. Don't celebrate it that we're getting rich and our lives are comfortable and we have all we need. Don't celebrate that. See it through the eyes of God, which should cause you to wail, because you may have it good now, but bad stuff is on the way. The miseries that are going to come upon you are a direct consequence of this. And I think it's important because people think, I'm comfortable now. It makes me think of the parable of the wealth of the farmer who had such a big crop, he tore down his barns and built new barns. And he said, I've got it good. I can just lay back and enjoy this. And the word to him is, the axe is at the root of the tree, essentially. You think you're going to enjoy your wealth, and it's going to be your undoing. And I think James is echoing that same sentiment when he calls upon these people to weep and wail, because don't think you have it good. Bad stuff is just around the corner for you.
And it's not just wealth; it's how they accumulated the wealth, right?
Yeah.
It's this. You cut all these corners. You've taken advantage of all these people to earn money, and perhaps he's suggests that they're thinking, if I get all this money, I'll be safe. And he's like, so you did all these terrible things to get all this money, and for what?
Right.
And it reminds me, what's the movie You Can't Take It With You? Isn't that an old movie with George Burns? I don't know.
Oh, you're probably right. Now, I can't. It's not coming to my mind.
Yeah, it's a classic
I only
Ron
think
reference
that-
where no one gets it.
That "Oh God" and "Oh God, you devil."
Yes.
Yeah, I remember
Burns?
those ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was
Anyway.
it from those or different? That's the
I
only
don't know.
George Burns memory I have.
Yeah, something like that. But I mean, that's what he's saying is you've done all this. You've treated your people so poorly, and for what? Because it's all going to go away. And a very strong indictment of their actions and their mentality.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big theme in this letter.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah.
so
without
that's
a
in
doubt.
the very first chapter, right? Let the rich will disappear like flower in the field. Verse 10 of the very first chapter. Like, he hits that early, and then the second chapter he gets into these people who are showing partiality to the rich at the expense of the poor. He's talking about worldly alliances, and now there's all out prophetic oracle against the rich.
Yeah.
It's not a minor theme in James. Like,
No.
this seems to be framing the whole thing.
I agree. In this passage in particular, it takes me back to when Suzanne and I owned our coffee shop. We had a coffee shop for 7 years, and we had a lot of employees. And I always thought about the way we treat our employees. Here these people, what James is saying is these people work for you, and you didn't pay them. And so I was always like, man, we got to make sure that everybody's taken care of first. This is convicting. And I always loved the way that Suzanne ran our finances, because she was the one in charge of that. And everybody got paid before us. We were the owners, but we were always the last ones to get paid because we wanted to honor God in the way we went about our business. I mean, the government got paid before we did. Our
course.
suppliers got paid before we did. And our employees got paid before we did. And so we just wanted to model this kind of a priority system to everybody we came in contact with from a business point of view.
So I have a question. We've done a whole series on hell and what it is and what it may not be.
Sure.
And we came down pretty strongly that it doesn't necessarily have to be an eternal torture situation.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yet here it says, weep and wail for miseries that are coming to you. And then it uses phrases like the gold and silver will eat your flesh like fire. So what do you do with those sorts of passages? And what's he referring to? Is he referring to an eternal torture, or is it perhaps something else?
I don't personally, if we start saying it's going to be really literal, then I think we're missing the
Right.
point. Yeah, I think that he's using imagery that is supposed to be scary. That there's going to be repercussions or ramifications for what you have done, and you're going to be miserable through the process. And so I think that the imagery he uses corresponds directly to the problem. And so, your riches have rotted, your clothes are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have rusted, and they will eat your flesh like fire. So, yeah, I think he's using imagery that correlates directly with the problem. But I think we have to be careful that we don't over literalize it to assume that the judgment is going to be that specifically. But having said that, he's saying you guys are going to face judgment for what you've done, and it's going to be a miserable experience for you. I think that's, for me, this is the big takeaway.
Yeah, I don't see anything that would hint at eternally. Right?
I don't disagree, but I could see
when
someone.
you think of what fire does to flesh,
Right.
it consumes it.
Yeah.
That's it. It's not like it will bask in the fire like gold. Like gold holds up under fire and is constantly, being subject to the fire. But and even the metaphor in the first chapter, like where the rich will, disappear like a flower in a field.
Mm-hmm.
All right, flowers don't disappear forever. They're there just for a very short period, and then they're gone. And so, yeah, if you wanted to use James to kind of talk about the length of everlasting judgment and what people experience, I think it would be shorter rather than longer.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just, that came to mind as we were reading through it. Obviously, he's using this stark imagery to talk about the severity of the offense, right? That this is so bad, this is what should happen to you. But not necessarily saying this is exactly what your future looks like in hell for eternity.
Yeah. Well, and I think fire imagery is one of the scariest forms of torture or pain, because it's not like a quick death. Fire is in many ways sort of a slow, painful way to experience pain, and in some situations it's very difficult to extinguish. And so I think there's something about being burned, either as a form of punishment or even as a form of death, that's more scary than other death. If you cut off somebody's head, it's over in an instant. Mm-hmm. But there's something about fire that's just particularly terrifying to people. And that's why it's such a good image in a situation like this.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the big questions is, who are these rich oppressors?
Mm-hmm.
And whether we're talking about people in this congregation who are the rich oppressors, or, again, are these the people that the people in the congregation are aspiring to be like and
wooing.
To become, or showing partiality toward them? And it is kind of tricky because you have, like you guys pointed out earlier, this begins, "Come now, you rich people," and the previous section began, "Come now, you who say tomorrow we will go to such and such a place," right? So they seem to be parallel, and if the people who want to go are the rich people, right, then it would be parallel, and maybe it is an in-house group, maybe a small group within the congregation, or an influential group, or want to be influential. Or it could be just building upon that. There are those who have plans to make money and get rich. Well, let me tell you what's going to happen to those who succeed and become rich. You maybe don't want to achieve your goal, But another layer of context, the section before, 2 sections back, begins, "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters." And then the section after these two is, "Be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters." And so you have these 2 sections that are kind of addressing them as brothers. And this is clearly fellow believers in the body language. There are 2 sections addressing believers in fraternal language that frame these, "Come now, those who want to get rich quick," and "Come now, those who succeed in getting rich." I don't know. What are your thoughts on, who is this? Are these rich people the church in this context?
Yeah, I like the idea. I think it's addressing, on the one hand, I feel like it's those wannabes, right, that we talked about, I think in the last episode, that they're the ones who want to become rich, and they're going to do what they can. So they're wooing rich people, and they're trying to emulate them, and they're doing all these things. And for me, it makes sense. They're in the body, they're part of the body, but they're trying to be something they're not supposed to be. And so on the one hand, like verse 13 of chapter 4, they're going to try to make these plans. And if I do this, then I can become rich too. And then I like what you said about, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to become like them. You're going to start taking advantage of people. You're going to be like the nations, and it's going to result in these terrible things, and you're going to get what you deserve, which isn't what you think it is. It's not going to be a life of luxury and enjoyment. It's going to be punishment. And so for me, that makes sense of how I view it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the only way.
Yeah, I think there's a possibility that it is rhetorical. And like you say, I'm not saying I fall one way or the other, because it's really hard to prove definitively. These people could be in the audience hearing this letter read, and the reader is sort of calling them out in a direct way. But at the same time, it could be a warning to the people who want to sidle up to these people. Maybe they're not here, but by saying, come now, you people who say we'll go to the city and live for a year, you people, who hold back the wages. By using it in a rhetorical sense, it's a way of sending a message to the people who want to get close to them and, bring them in and give them positions in the body to say, here's what they're going to experience ultimately. And anybody standing close to them is going to get caught up in the shrapnel. Do you want to be those people? Or are you willing to say, you know what? God's kingdom has a very different ethic. And so we were tempted by that. You've drawn our attention to it. We were kind of gone off the rails. We're going to recommit ourselves to not being those people. So like I said, they could be in the audience and James could be speaking directly to them as a way of convicting them, or it's rhetorical to win back the audience that he really cares about, to keep them from going down that road. Like I said, I'm 50-50 on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Either way, it just seems, I don't hear a lot of talk like this in congregational settings, in even books that are written about discipleship and wealth, and money and, being a follower of Jesus. But James found it really necessary to tell this group of Christians that this is the fate that awaits those who aspire to become wealthy and do it in ways that hurt other people. This is their future, and they fatten themselves up for the slaughter. You don't want to be those people.
Right.
And you don't want to show partiality toward those people, and you don't want to rely upon those people. It's just such a strong warning that I don't think it gets sounded enough today.
Very good point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got the health and wealth gospel people, which is not us, and that's the whole thing. But we do so much like mincing words. In order to make budget, we need people to give, right? Yeah. So it's hard to push back against financial, gaining finances, because the church will benefit from that. Yeah, it's a tough call. And then we also water down, like when Jesus tells the man to sell everything and follow him, like, well, that's for that dude. It's not for everyone, which is, I guess, true, but also maybe it is for us. We assume it's not for any of us. It's only for that one dude. And so it's hard. We definitely live in a world where money talks, and we try to stay away from it, right? Money and politics, we don't talk about that in church. Is that right? So,
yeah. Well, this is a challenge for us here at the college because obviously, we have things like tuition where students are paying for their education, but we recognize that that's a hard thing when you ask students to bear that full burden. It's like they're racking up lots of debt. Student debt is a big conversation that we're having across the board, not just in Christian higher ed, but education in general. And so part of the solution for that is to have income coming into the college that allows us to offset that so that students don't have to bear the full weight of paying for their education. But that money's got to come from somewhere. And so it comes from donors. And we're so thankful for those people who send us, $20 a month or whatever. That makes such a big difference. But when you find that big donor who's willing to walk in and write a big check, it's like, oh, thank you. And we've got to make sure that we're still listening to this as well. And there's nothing wrong with those big donors. We're grateful for them who are willing to help us out at the college. Thank you so much for what you do. But we've got to be willing to have the same conversation, in the churches and the college, any place where we're trying to do things God's way. We've got to ask good questions about the kinds of people that we're getting close to and saying, we love your help. We're so glad to have your help, but let's make sure that we're reflecting God's kingdom in the way we're going about our business here.
Yeah. There are lots of big donors in the Bible
Yeah.
and the New Testament. And
Yes, there are,
surrounding
yeah.
Jesus' ministry. And I think the case study of Zacchaeus, this really wealthy guy, and he, not all of his wealth was legitimate, right? And, and coming to Jesus, man, he had to become a big donor.
Yeah.
He had to be blessed with that much money is to be responsible to use that to be a blessing to others.
Yeah.
And if Zacchaeus was going to become a Jesus follower, he was going to learn how to give big to those who needed it. And for him to not give big as one who has been given much, then you start drifting into the passages like this, to get big and to use it for yourself.
Yep.
That's what they do in the world, and that is fattening themselves up for a slaughter.
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't push away from passages like this. The good news for the rich people is that there's a way to give big. There's a way to invest, to make kingdom friendships. Jesus' scandalous teaching in Luke, right? That gaining wealth but through dishonest measures. But he's using that as an analogy for like radical generosity to kingdom causes. And so there's a place for wealth, but it's in that radical generosity with it. There's not a place for wealth the way the world does it.
Yeah. And that's where I kind of want to be careful that we don't assume that every rich person falls into this category. Because it'd be easy for somebody to hear this and walk away and go, all the wealthy are going to be burned up. No, that's not what we're saying. There are wealthy people out there who practice a radical amount of generosity. They recognize that God is the one who has made it possible for me to have this, level of abundance. And so the question that I have to ask as a wealthy person, not Ron, because I am not, but the wealthy person has to ask is, okay, God, you've put me in a position to have this. How do I honor you with it? And I think the answer is very clear. Don't use it for yourself. Don't assume it's so you can have an easy life and all that. That your job now is to be that agent of God's generosity and look for the various ways that you can transfer this to God's kingdom, to the churches and to people. And I think a big part of that for the wealthy is going to be to say, don't expect it to buy you influence. If you think that because you're wealthy, now you get to influence the church, part of the lesson you have to learn is, no, okay, your generosity is wonderful, and thank you so much for it, but don't think it gives you a bigger voice in what God is trying to do. There are other things that God is looking for to determine who those people are going to be.
Yeah. So the one thing is clear in James is, from the kingdom perspective that James clearly has, wealth, the accumulation of wealth is playing with fire. And he's just warning people against getting sucked into that world.
Yeah.
And we have to, at least to be sufficiently biblical, right? We have to at least pay heed to that message.
Yeah.
And preach and teach when we talk about money. Don't get sucked into it. You're playing with fire.
Yeah.
There are examples of how people who are exceptional and following Jesus without letting the wealth consume them.
Yep.
They need to really lean into those exceptional people and see what they did and imitate their generosity.
Yeah.
But if you're not going to do that, these warnings, and maybe it's warnings like these that got people to be generous in that way.
Yeah.
And so I think James is not trying to bring bad news to the wealthy. He's trying to show them a path forward.
Yeah.
And warn them away from a path that leads to destruction.
Yeah. Well, you pointed out earlier, the Bible is filled with passages about wealthy people. I think of like Lydia in the book of Acts, and the women who supported Jesus' ministry in Luke's gospel. So, yeah, they're out there, but they've got lessons that they have to learn. So
that wraps it up. This slow to anger section, and we've seen that it's not about counting to 10 before you do something rash. This slow to anger is about don't construct your lifestyle around the things of this world, animated by the wisdom of this world. That is what leads to division and anger and exploiting people and fights and bickering and disputes and murder. Like this, the worldly path is the path to anger. And now that he's kind of made that case, he's able to kind of bring together, kind of in a conclusion, all right, now how we're going to land this plane, and what are some practical suggestions we have going forward.
Yeah. So picking up verse 7, we're going to read 7 through 12 here. James writes, "Be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until he receives the early and the late rains. You must also be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Brothers and sisters, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Indeed, we call blessed those who show endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about, for the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Above all, brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation." I like how it begins with patience. And, this is something that I can relate to, the idea of the farmer waits for the precious crop. As somebody who, does a lot of gardening and, very small time farming, I understand how patience works. You put in plants and it takes months before you begin seeing the fruit. And so you just learn that you make an investment and you have to wait. And sometimes you keep making investments like, water and fertilizer and keeping the weeds and the pests away and all that. And so patience isn't just sitting back, but it's really still a constant engagement. But patience is necessary, but you do it confident that that the fruit is going to come. And so I love the imagery of the farmer who waits for the precious crop from the earth, because it just, like I said, it hits home for me. And I think it's an important lesson. Make the investment, be patient, and really trust in God to be the one who's going to bring about the fruitfulness.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is a tough thing between patience and then when they talk about Job, they switch words to endurance, right? And there's a difference for me in those things. Like patience is just like, okay, like I understand where things are, and but endurance is like, for me there's more emotions involved. Like I'm a little angry about it, but I'm gonna put my head down and I'm gonna deal with it. And I think that's why it's a different word for Job, because he doesn't seem to be terribly patient in the book, but he definitely endures. Right? I mean, most of the book, he's like, God needs to come and I need to have a conversation like right now. Like, what's the holdup here? Right? But he endures his suffering until the end and receives it. So there's for me, it's like two kind of different approaches to it all. And I don't know if we're sussing that out or not, but both I think are required for proper obedience.
Yeah, this the Job reference has some people thinking this might not be referring to the Hebrew book of Job, but the Testament of Job, the intertestamental book where Job is like a 100% kind of saintly figure throughout the book. Whereas in the book of Job, he's patient in the bookends, but like the heart of Job, he's defiant.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
I want my day in court.
Yeah, and he's making demands of God that are above his pay grade, and it gets him into trouble. So, that is interesting. Yeah, but he doesn't seem to be an exemplar of patience throughout the entire book of Job.
Yeah, and yet, over and over as a kid, you heard about the patience of Job, which, again, it doesn't say. It says the endurance or the steadfastness of Job, which is, for me, is a different thing.
Yeah. Well, when I think of endurance, I often think of endurance athletes, runners, triathletes, people like that who, especially the ones who are doing like marathons or Ironman triathlons or whatever. And I've never done those distances, but I've run like a half marathon and I've done triathlons. And like I always tell people, I did like a dozen triathlons, and every single one, about halfway through, you're just like, I want to be done. It's not fun. It's not like you're doing this because it's just I love it so much and I wish it would never end. Like all you're thinking about is I can't wait to cross the finish line. But you do it. Really, it's kind of a test. You just want to prove to yourself and the people around you can do it. But a lot of it's pushing through the pain. And that's where, I think of Job a little bit, where it's like you're suffering, but you realize the suffering has an objective. Now, Job didn't really realize that. He just wanted his day in court. But I think the idea of James is like endurance means you're going to suffer, but you know that there's an end, and the end will make it worth it. And so endurance is really important for being a Christian. Just know it's going to hurt sometimes. If you're doing if you're running a race or whatever, it's going to hurt. But the finish line makes it all worthwhile. And so, like I said, that's the image that I always have in my mind when it comes to that endurance language.
Yeah. And it makes us wish we knew more about the specific situation of the book.
Right.
Yeah.
This, the book started out again by saying, you undergo trials of various kinds, don't give in to temptation. And, there's something they're struggling with and facing. Obviously, they're in an awkward, uncomfortable place as a body, and some are being impatient. Some are looking to try to get rich quick through these schemes and plans. Some are trying to make strategic alliances with the world and friendships, and show partiality to kind of bring the right people in here. And I think the patience and linked to the endurance is like these solutions are not the solution. And I feel like going back to the Old Testament with Israel wanting to be great like the nations, and God had a vision for Abraham, his descendants, that they would be great, right? But the shortcut is by way of kingship like the nations. That gave them a temporary kind of greatness that could never last because it wasn't consistent with God's will. The alternative to that is patience. Wait for the Lord to bless you his way. He could have used the example of Abraham, right, who's told he was going to have a son, and he wasn't patient. And it's like, all right, well, maybe through the slave woman, Hagar, or maybe, he's trying all these alternatives to having a son. Maybe adopting Lot to come along with him and be the heir. No, be patient for God to bring his blessing his way. He has good things in mind for you, and it takes a while to get there sometimes. And we are an impatient people who want to get there sooner, and we don't want to endure the trials of the long journey.
Yeah.
And so whatever the struggle is, I think we would reconstruct it by going backwards from the things he warns them against doing throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
The partiality is not the route. Trips and accumulating wealth, not the route. Friendship with the world, not the route.
Right.
Becoming rich, snuggling up with the rich, not the route. Patience until something that God does.
I agree with all what you said, but as we read it, for me, I feel, and this could be wrong, but it seems like it's almost like there's an audience switch for me, because he's been lambasting these people, right? These wannabes. And then here, I mean, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like now he's turning to the people who are doing it right.
Yes.
Right? He says, be patient, and verse 8 is, be patient, strengthen your hearts for the coming of the Lord. And then 9 especially is, don't grumble against one another. Because I could see if, I'm doing all the right things, and I keep losing, and they keep getting, and I could see them being very frustrated and grumbling. And so I almost wonder if he's like, now, I've let them have it. Now, I'm not letting you have it. I'm just letting you know, just keep doing what you're doing and don't fall into the temptation of, grumbling, gossiping, talking badly about these other people who are doing it wrongly. Is that off, or is that?
Well, I think you're exactly right about the audience switch here. I feel it too. And we're going to feel it again about those who are suffering.
Yeah.
I feel like the congregation as a whole, I think, is probably on the poorer side, probably on the struggling side. And then there are people within the body that are tempted to, they want to make things right. They want to be the fixers, and they know, because they have this wisdom and experience from the world, and they want to bring it to bear, I assume, on behalf of this wider body, right, who is experiencing suffering, is experiencing lowliness. There are the lowly that are being pushed aside as they're showing favoritism to the rich. So I think the congregation, that's why I wonder, who is the rich? I don't think it's the whole church.
No.
Because, we have from the earlier chapters that people are showing impartiality toward the poor in the church to guests who are rich, right, and showing them favoritism. So I think the bulk of the body is probably being addressed here. I think he's been done. The slow to anger, I think, had a very specific audience to it, those who were making friends with the world. But I suspect they were trying to do these strategic friendships on behalf of the wider body that doesn't have those kinds of connections, it is suffering at some level, and they're trying to be the solution.
I can't but wonder if part of it goes back to another Old Testament connection. In the Exodus narrative, frequently the people grumbled against Moses. And that's a reoccurring theme, this whole grumbling. It's like God does something great and they're really happy until they don't have water. And if God does something great and they're really happy until they don't have food. And each step along the way, they start grumbling. And for the poor here, part of their grumbling might be, well, I thought God was going to take care of us, and where's our provision? And it's like, don't make the same mistakes as the Israelites. God will provide. He has made it abundantly clear that God will always provide. So don't fall into the trap of grumbling, because we know it didn't go well for them. Grumbling always brought about bad results. And so, just learn the lesson of the Old Testament and don't fall into that. But you're trusting God, he says there in verse 11, you've heard about the endurance of Job, seeing the outcome that the Lord brought about. For the Lord is compassionate and merciful. That's the God we serve. He is compassionate and merciful. And I always say my favorite definition of mercy is kindness and concern for somebody in serious need. And so he is the kind of God who sees your need and is going to have both a kind disposition and concern for you. And he will step in and take care of you. So trust in the God that we know, who is compassionate and merciful, and don't fall into this trap of grumbling.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question before we move on, so you can ask yours if you're not moving on.
I was going to pivot to verse 12.
So before that, go ahead. You do you, bro.
Well, I was just going to ask, in the context of
Yeah.
all that we've been saying,
right.
what is this swearing that they're
Yeah.
tempted to do, this yes or no thing? What do you think is going on with that? Because this reminds us exactly what Jesus says.
Yeah, he says the exact same thing.
And James is quoting Jesus and applying that quote to their situation. I don't think it's just a floating parable. It's like, remember what Jesus said and apply it to your situation.
On the one hand, on the far end, it could be calling down a curse on people. Like when you're swearing by things, like it could be adjuring God or whatever to, if they're really ticked about these people doing these things, that's an extreme sort of thing. I'm not sure that's exactly where it's at, but that could be part of that whole oath making.
But the tension between them
has boiled over into, we call it violence because you're probably asking God to do something strongly about it. That's one possible. I think that's probably not it, but it could be.
I mean, I see it as maybe a call to kind of taking a step back and among the poor, embracing a more simple way of doing life. You don't have to make these grandiose oaths, swearing by the temple and the gold on the temple and all these kinds of things. But we're going to be the people who just are like, if I say yes, you can trust it. I'm going to do it. That's the kind of God we serve. If God says, I'm going to take care of you, you can trust. His yes is yes, and he doesn't have to swear. You just know he's going to do it. And so imitate him. Be the same kind of God. Same kind of people who imitate God. Mm-hmm. And if you say yes, it's yes. If you say no, it's no. That's who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, the closest thing that in this book it concretely echoes is chapter 4, verse 17. And this is after he says, those who say today or tomorrow I will do such a thing, go and make money somewhere. And then he ends that paragraph by saying, anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin. Like there are people who have these grandiose intentions to do these things, to help the poor maybe, to get wealthy. And at the end of the day, he has to say, don't be doing this. Don't be focusing on these, get rich quick schemes out there. There's a way to help people now. There's something in front of you now. If you know the right thing to do now, do it now. And that reminds me of this. Let your yes be yes and no be no. If you're committed to this thing, do it, or don't do it. If you're committed to the kingdom, be committed to it, or don't be committed to it. If you're going to commit to this wealth, then just say no. Say no to the kingdom and invest yourself fully into the worldly treasures. At least you'll inherit those treasures, right? And they will fade and pass, and you will wither away, just like the prophecy. But, he wants them to say yes to the kingdom and make that their only commitment and their primary commitment, and to keep their yes to God. I don't know.
That makes more sense to my cursing one, but that's fine.
Yeah, hard
You
to
had a
tell.
question. You had a question.
I do. So it's a translational choice by the translators. And I want to, so yours, I think, everywhere is now brothers and sisters, right? So like verse 7, be patient, therefore, say brothers and sisters, right? 5,
right, yeah.
And it's 12 says, above all my brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So mine
9.
says brothers and sisters everywhere, my NRSV, not non-you, except here. In verse 7, it says, be patient, therefore, beloved. Verse 9, beloved. Verse 10, and patience, beloved. And then verse 12, above all, my beloved. And I think it's fascinating in context of where it's talking about the audience change. I don't know if that was on the minds of the translators. It's just weird that, because the text says brothers. And so all the way through the James, wherever it says brothers and sisters, it's brothers when they're using the inclusive. And here normally you would continue using that brothers and sisters, but they've chosen to use beloved. And I don't know why.
So you're saying in which verse has
Just
the beloved?
chapter 5, verse 7, 9, 10, and 12 all uses beloved, where it's brothers / brothers and sisters.
So that's your translation says
NRSV,
beloved.
correct.
And so what does the Greek have?
Yeah, so that's what I'm looking up here. So, so verse 7, it's just brothers. It's not brothers and sisters.
Right. None of them
It's
should
just
be brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Verse 9.
Yeah, I'm sure it's probably the same.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I assume it's all brothers,
It
which
is.
which is why your the updated NRSV does brothers and sisters.
Yours just has beloved.
has beloved. They're 7 through 12. Every time it's brothers and sisters, they choose beloved. I think that's fascinating why they did that just there when the rest of the book is brothers and sisters. And they end there in verse 19 with brothers and sisters. And so like it's only this section where they choose beloved. And I don't know why.
That is very interesting. So
Yeah.
it must have been an attempt at gender inclusive, like when James, just like Paul, uses brothers, that's his way of referring with fraternal admonition, or not admonition, fraternal love,
Yeah.
brotherly love, love one another. That beloved is how you refer to the body of Christ. And John uses beloved language a lot, literally beloved language, right, in the Greek.
Yeah.
So maybe the NRSV was trying to move away from gender-specific language to talk about the term of endearment and closeness, familial closeness, using the word beloved.
Right. But I mean, it's like
Why
when he
do-
uses brothers and sisters, they use brothers as the rest of the book, just not here.
Very inconsistent.
And I mean, like we said, if he does switch audience there to specific people as opposed to just the bad rich people or the wannabe rich people, I don't know. Maybe they're signaling that as well. It's just I happen to notice it, and like I don't understand why.
Well, it's clearly a choice on the part of the translators.
Yes, for
because
sure.
it's not a James choice.
Correct.
And-
James is consistent. Translators are not.
So now you're raising this question that I don't feel like I have the ability to answer at the moment. It's like, why would you change over to beloved?
Right.
And like you said, John does it, but it's always like agape toy,
Right.
for beloved.
Mhm.
And so it's a very natural translation of that. Man, the NRSV is so old that we probably can't get in contact with some of the original translators of it. I just wonder if they're still even alive. But it would be really kind of interesting to find out. Now I just want to send an email and say, can you explain to me why you chose to translate brothers and sisters for brothers in some places and then beloved in others? Is it stylistic? You're just like, we got so tired of it. The redundancy of it was too much. We had to switch our words.
I mean, the Delphoi, the brothers and sisters, is throughout James.
Oh, yeah.
They use it pretty much every other paragraph, it seems like.
Right, yeah. Uses it a lot.
But why just here do they choose to change it up a little bit?
yeah.
well, your theory that it helps signal a change in audience, that they're trying to, now we're focusing on you, our people. Now we're done talking about hypothetical wannabes.
Right.
And now I think that's a good theory as any.
I mean, it's
I'm
yeah.
chilling with the table at the moment.
Well, now I want to go like
Yeah, we got you. I've
No,
sent us
so to be-
such a
so-
rabbit trail.
I'm going down. Yeah, I'm going down the trail. I should.
To be clear, though, the NRSV UE updated edition fixes it
Yeah,
by going with brothers and sisters
All the way through.
consistently. all the way through.
consistently all
Right.
the way through.
Yeah. So another reason to get the latest Bible translations.
Maybe, unless the other ones are right. I don't know.
Well, and how many more initials can we get out there? It's not the NRSV anymore. It's the NRSV UE. It's just like after the UE, what would be the updated edition, part 2, P2 or whatever. It's like it's just going to keep getting longer and longer and longer all the way. So, I don't know. We've only got a couple minutes left here, and I kind of got a lot to say about this last section. So,
I say we call it.
what do you mean call it? Like do it or put it off to the next one?
Put it off to the next one.
Okay, that's kind of what I was
I'll
thinking.
call
so
it the end of the episode.
That's probably the right thing to do.
People have already turned off when I started talking about the other things, so they stopped listening like 5 minutes ago.
Sam,
When
would
it
you
brought
please stop that?
stupid translation issues. Who cares?
Looks like we're going to have another one. So,
One more.
Sounds good.
well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen.
After class.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist. Social media is managed by Darren Harris.